So, hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. Really appreciate your tuning in. And I can't wait to talk with Andrea. We've known each other for so long. And we were in Provincetown at the same time, even though we didn't know it at that time. So I think there's going to be a lot to say between us. And I love their work. I love Paul. And
I love Paul.
Oh, stop it. So I'm going to read, I'm not sure this is exactly a representative section, but as I said to Andrea beforehand, there might not be a representation of this representative section of this book because it changes tone a lot. I thought since we're all about 5 or 6 weeks into quarantine that I would read something that might make us laugh. So this is a section called X-rated. I don't think I need to say anything more. It was a porn party that's all I'll say. X-rated. The new crop of work center fellows talk about sex a lot, much more than if the work center were in Peterborough or Saratoga Springs. Sex is in the air. Sex is in our work. It's changing our work in heightened, unexpected ways. One night, to stave off the off-season boredom, one of us decides to have a porn viewing party. Maybe it is Lucy. It sounds like an idea Lucy would cook up. Lucy is always ready to provoke and unsettle. As a group, we have no intellectual agenda about this gathering. The intention is not to make any connections to the work of Judith Butler or Eve Sedgwick or any other theorist. Perhaps to do so would be to make this evening too safe. Nor is anyone out to stir up erotic feelings between us. Our sexual desires are fairly well known to one another, and we're pretty much certain that what we're looking for is not to be found among us. But maybe Lucy is out to break down some boundaries. Her apartment sits out on the harbor, off the compound, and she has a TV and a VCR. Her living room accommodates a veritable crowd, 8 of us. One of us is designated to go out to City Video and rent porn films. Dress Up for Daddy, a lesbian BDSM film. A film starring Long Dong Silver, reportedly a favorite of Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas. A film by Falcon Studios featuring white, gay, gym-worked men, and a compilation of bloopers, terrible straight porn bloopers. I'm not sure who might end up accompanying on the trip. I am more than happy to be an accomplice. Once we start looking, our faces and postures change. The temperature of Lucy's living room changes. The occasional nervous laugh. We don't feel comfortable looking at one another. It is mysteriously unnerving to train our eyes to the actions on the screen, the mouth moving up and down on a dick, the eyes theatrically closed, the faces performing transcendence, ecstasy, submission. Doesn't Sontag list stag film Seen Without Lust as one of the prime examples of camp? The gay film. I feel protective of the gay film, even though I know it's a bit predictable, orderly, and clean. The guys are white, swollen, striated, muscular. They look expensive. One is wearing a black leather vest, black chaps. These are intended to be props of transgression, but that is as far as the transgression will go. The guys are very serious about themselves. They look like the types who might tend bar down the street but never crack a joke. Each sex act follows the template of the day. Small talk, a hand on the shoulder, leaning in, some kissing, some sucking, perhaps some gentlemanly ass eating, a shy lick here and there. A condom is rolled on, bowls and howls and guttural noises. Excuse me. My contacts are misbehaving or getting excited. Howls and guttural noises, fighting the thread count out of the sheets. You get the picture. The fucking looks vigorous and athletic, but that's all it is. There's no passion, none of the awkwardness of human feeling. Nothing in the film embarrasses me. It looks like 100 other films out there. I probably would never rent such a movie myself, as it might be the gay porn version of my friend Denise's high-end kitchen. No mess, and the fires can be turned down with a knob. The moves are in style. The moves don't conjure up ideas of sleaze or bad taste. It's all polished and curated, and maybe on the way to cold, not a body hair or blemish in sight. And what else should I expect in the age of AIDS, when bodies are getting prematurely old in the houses to the right and left of us? My sense is that my friends are on the edge of bored. Maybe their boredom is a bit of a performance. The room might get nervous if any one of us, female or male, couldn't quite sit still. Yet, I can also imagine no one wanting to offend me. Perhaps they think I would take it personally, cry out, "Ha, homophobe, I always knew it," and start tearing up. There is certainly no revulsion in the air, but my friends seem disappointed, as if they were hoping to see something brazen, raw, and enthralling, just a single rough move to make them turn their heads away. Perhaps they were hoping that gay sex would show them something new about being human, about the inherent possibilities of the body. But no, the gay film has let them down in its dedication to ritual, which doesn't stop me from gazing at it with fellow feeling and pride, as if I'm a World War II veteran at an army reunion looking at footage of the invasion of Normandy. No one cracks a joke. No one stands up to smoke a cigarette out on the back deck. Lucy still sounds excited, with a voice that wants to believe the world is much bigger than the one we've been given. Fast forwarding through the rest of the film, I look around at my friends and think, you still like me? Maybe I am anticipating parental objection on a certain level. A different film is eased into the VCR and boundaries slip. We're uncomfortable again. We don't know what to do with this language. There is a shade of danger here, some actual transgression. Dress up for daddy. Daddy in a movie filled with women? It is smart. Instantly, it feels like a labor of love versus a commercial product. It understands a thing or two about roles and masks and the way desire makes use of projection screens. Not all of them politically correct, most not. But alongside that, it manages to be hot. No small thing when most of us in the room are not lesbians, or at least not yet. We are transported. We've all slipped into some interior state. There is a dream passing back and forth between us. We are breathing. The windows are steamed. What's that monstrous thing? A dildo? And while we might not all be aroused by what we see, we are absolutely in its grip. Whatever is happening has the power of mystery and subversion, but it manages to get there by the plastic, the fake. But for Mindy, the lone lesbian among us, it's too much. The blush scorches her face. She leaps out of the room onto the back deck, where she might smoke a cigarette. Does Mindy even smoke cigarettes? I imagine her standing at the rail. I imagine her looking out at the harbor, moonlit and cold, trying to catch her breath, embarrassed and mystified by the intensity of her own reaction. While she's out there, we worry together that we've offended her. Has any of us said the wrong thing? Soon Mindy will walk back in with a nervous laugh, crossing her arms, rubbing the shiver out of her elbows. We resume the night in the hopes that the fun won't be spoiled by too much genuine feeling. The bloopers film gets put aside almost immediately, farts and premature ejaculations and running out to take a dump. It thinks sex is disgusting, thinks human bodies are ugly. It hates people and was likely conceived and directed by someone who was never the object of someone else's desire, who never had satisfying sex in his life. Why did I trip over that? We go instantly to the straight video. What is there to say about it? The actors here have done these moves so many times, they can't help but rely on animal memory to get the work done. They're not at home, not in their heads or in their bodies. They're not exactly bored, but they're not so present either. Maybe some of them are simply drugged, but not on ecstasy or acid, but in a K-hole, which is another way to say mild cat tranquilizer. Even I don't get unsettled by a close-up of a vagina. On the screen, the vagina looks as friendly as a handbag, a pink one from TJ Maxx. Maybe this is because the women are performing a kind of theatricality that doesn't align with their own pleasure, their inner lives. Rather, it is to convince the men, who are not especially dashing or endowed, that they are horse-hung studs holding reservoirs of uncontaminated semen inside them. The point hasn't been to vote on the best of the films, but as a group of artists and writers, we are obsessed with standards and we cannot help articulating our standards. A vote is cast. The winner? Dress Up for Daddy. Some venture to say was the only hot one, and I silently keep my mouth shut about the Falcon film being plenty hot for me. I just want to be a lesbian. One after another of us declares, as if a dumb joke is one way to restore order and distance, as if there's nothing inherently patronizing about such a statement. I will talk to Elizabeth about this night many years later. I want to know if I've remembered it correctly. How could any of that translate to an online realm in which we're always just one click away from porn? Yeah, that was a bad idea, Elizabeth says. And we leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I feel like I get to be having it has the experience of having a private reading.
I feel a little embarrassed. Weirdly, I feel less embarrassed when I'm reading that with a group because it feels participatory, and when people laugh or go oh my God, it just feels like I'm a part of the experience and we've replicated that experience. But to read it, I was glad to have you as company, and I know you all are out there, but
yeah, I feel like we're having we're you just kind of did a cam boy show and everybody was watching me watch it, so there's an element of that feels strange, and the book that feels very relevant in terms of thinking about performativity in the book, which you're doing so much of. I love the way you write about sex. It's one of the things I love about your writing, and in this book you talked, before you started reading, you talked about how you find that the book changes tone throughout. That section changes tone so much, and it is representative in a way, because that beautiful shift from really funny to moving and thoughtful, and then just gut-wrenching too. I thought there were multiple moments where I had that.
I'm not very good at staying in my lane. I just don't think consciousness stays in one lane. I'm interested in how the mind moves from moment to moment, and it just shows up like that, honestly, once I'm embedded in a memory or a scene.
Yeah, so the book is organized in sections, and in the sections there are a series of fragments, really, that have titles and that are either longer or shorter. For those who haven't had the deep pleasure of reading the book yet, you will have this pleasure. But one of the things I was noticing is they are scenes. I'm wondering if you could talk about this shift, the way that you write memoir as a fiction writer.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah, the original draft of this book, which I wrote fairly quickly in 2015 at an artist colony, was entirely in past tense. It was all narrative. It had a kind of forward motion to it. And I lived with that for a while, and for some reason, it felt wrong to me. It really didn't capture the on-the-spotness of that experience. It didn't feel messy enough. And I ended up spending a summer at Provincetown in 2016. And I remember one night thinking about the moon on the harbor and how that changes the surface of the harbor into something that's otherworldly and looks it looks like it's out of Fellini. It's too beautiful for mundane everyday life. And it occurred to me that what the book was missing was a series of lyric moments that worked as a kind of interruption. Because to my mind, Provincetown just doesn't move in clock time. It doesn't move according to the calendar, even though everyone's conscious of the summer. It does something quite peculiar to your experience of the hours. And it's like a Laura Nero song. If any of you know Laura Nero, it just, it breathes and contracts and doesn't move in 4/4 time. It's constantly shifting meter. So what I did after all that after living with the book for a while was to flip it in present tense. And then I introduced many of those fragmentary lyric moments. And for a while I thought I was making a big old mess, and I would read it in past tense. It really wants to be this. And somehow I breathed along with its awkwardness. And, after a while it told me what it wanted to be. It had already become itself.
That makes so much sense. And I think the present tense, which I often sort of resist in fiction, here it really is grounding me as a reader. It just grounds me in the present, and I'm more open to that lyrical attention. And I really I loved and appreciated the writing on the level of the sentence, but also just the flow of time in a way that wasn't always linear or wasn't always. I mean, there is a a movement and propulsion, but it's not. It doesn't have that more conventional structure, and it felt almost. I like that you said Fellini. It reminds me of the section Boatyard, where there's the thinking about the ways in which, like, how would Fellini direct like a scene at Dick Dock, right? Like that was really interesting to me. But I think the stuff you're talking about time being different in Provincetown and the structure of the novel feels like a queer structure, or I call it a novel, but a memoir, right? The structure of the memoir, like a queer structure, thinking about queer time. And you mentioned Jose Munoz, and you're engaging with a lot of queer theory. You have epigraphs from many different queer theorists throughout. And I'm thinking about the ways in which the memoir is also, it feels like in some ways like Bartesian, like A Lover's Discourse, where you've got the fragments and the engagement with all these other thinkers, and there's as much memoir as there is argument also building. Would you say there's like argument in this book?
I hope so. I mean, I tried to enact argument through the senses and through scene, but I really wanted the book to enact queerness, and especially what Munoz says about queerness being the thing we might not ever touch, and queerness being a potentiality, a warm. I'm screwing up, but like a warmish possibility on the horizon. We may never be queer. So I wanted that spirit to inhabit the book from sentence to sentence.
I think it so does. And I think there's lots of talk, like there's a lot in the book about performance and performativity, whether it's to do with fashion or like I think there's a lot of really interesting writing, like fashion and butchness. I think it's really, I love to think about that. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, that, like the appreciation, the inclusion, the welcoming of a certain kind of fashion style that wasn't the fashion style of the outside world was so thrilling to me. When I first got to Provincetown, I'm sure you remember this too. I mean, I was very conscious of people making themselves up. Like, everyone in town had a responsibility in a way. And it was not, no one ever talked about this, but when you walked down the street, you had a persona to take care of. And that seemed so thrilling to me because that persona, permitted a kind of vulnerability and honesty and a kind of sense of humor that wasn't possible within the garb of this, the streetwear of the other world. And my friend who's named Hollis in the book told me right away, no, those straight boy clothes, those Iowa City MFA clothes do not work here. And he literally, dressed me over and took me out to get a motorcycle jacket and told me how to tear holes in my pants and wear Doc Martens. And there was something so alive and thrilling about not only being given permission to dress differently, but it is also like I felt like it was a welcoming into selfhood, not just selfhood, but community.
Totally.
I still remember, my friend Polly and I talk about wearing our Provincetown clothes upcake to like Chatham and people being really, like sitting out in the steps of a library and smoking. In 1991, that seemed really shocking. Like they didn't know what to do with us.
Oh, I'm sure. That reminds me of sort of getting stuff in Provincetown. I remember I had this pair of vinyl pants that I spent a lot of money on.
Did you buy them now?
Yeah, that place like Summer Camp or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, like not Pennsylvania Company. No. Summer Camp. Where was it?
What the heck was it? It was all the way down. Oh gosh,
like
it was
toward where MAP used to be.
Yeah, maybe it was MAP. And then later
maybe it was MAP.
Maybe I got him at MAP.
MAP was everything to me.
MAP was the place where I'd spend all my tips at MAP.
Yeah.
And then I remember taking those vinyl pants back to Iowa City, as a matter of fact, and just feeling like such a, I don't even know what I was like. I got my Provincetown clothes on. And
was there appreciation in Iowa City for the Provincetown?
No, totally. Iowa City was you were there. I think we were in different.
But I was not there after. Well, I did go back to Iowa City after Provincetown, but it was different.
Yeah,
it would have been different a few years previous.
Yeah. Well, I think also your scene was the workshop and my scene was the bar.
Right.
So that was a little bit different there.
Yeah.
But we crossed paths so much in Provincetown.
I know.
I find that so, I don't know what, like heartening. It makes me feel like less lonely right now to think of us on the same tables outside Cafe Express.
Exactly. Yeah. When I first read Paul, I was thinking, how does Andrea know not just Cafe Express, but Doty's Diner? I mean, the references in your book are so specific and thrilling and do so much to conjure up this period. And it just like broke open my head.
That's what when I was reading later, I was having that exact experience where I thought, well, you also lived in Provincetown year round for a really long time, I think, right?
I did. Well, year round from 1991 to 90. Well, and then, but there were some, once I was in a relationship, we would go away for a semester at a time. So it's weird. I mean, I was there all the time from 91 to 95, completely straight through.
Yeah.
And then from 95 to 2007, I was usually there for half the year.
Your deep knowledge of the landscape, the town, the businesses, the people, the dunes. I mean, the names of people I hadn't thought about in so many years. It was just descriptions of a stretch of Commercial Street. I thought like, your knowledge of the place is so deep. And I've heard you say in other interviews, that you don't want to, that you sort of like don't want to be writing like the representative Provincetown book. But for me, it is, for me, you've captured that moment. Sorry.
Thanks. No, I mean, if that, I just didn't want to colonize it or own it for people who have, their own experience of it. Because I mean, I think I've said this in interviews as well, that part of the experience of Provincetown is like conveying it or relating it to a newcomer. And that keeps the story of Provincetown active. And I've seen so many times, I've overheard conversations, not only on Commercial Street, but say on the ferry or even the Peter Pan bus, like someone saying, this is where you should go and this is where you should go. And I'm always rolling my eyes, but that's essential to Provincetown.
Totally.
And my thinking is that there are multiple Provincetowns happening at every given moment that really are keyed into a person's individual story of freedom.
Yeah, and I like that idea also, that there's something about having like a guide or a mentor, or, you know, like there's somebody who sort of like takes you under their wing when you get to town.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe not everybody has that exact experience, but people do. Like maybe the story of Provincetown takes them under its wing. Yeah. Or something. I've been thinking, you know, the book's so much about Provincetown, and it's also so much about being queer in the early 90s. And in the, I mean, everybody's been talking about nothing other than global pandemics, but as people who were young in another pandemic, I really felt that sort of sense of something about a writer, you know, like to read somebody from the same generation who lived through something that, you know, we have really different experiences, but we were there at the same time, and to see your reflections so much later on that time was also really moving to me and helped me think about the time then, and you know, the ways in which we can take some of what we may have learned at that time for help now, you know, for use now. Masha Gessen just wrote this piece, maybe you read it in the New Yorker, like lessons. No. It's really, it's great. It's interesting. They were talking about, you know, like one lesson from AIDS, like the lessons they took from their work with ACT UP. One lesson from AIDS was about the power of communities coming together to take care of one another, to touch one another, to act using bodies, often frail bodies, to fight. And maybe the most important lesson I learned from the AIDS epidemic was that it would end. I thought some of those things were really moving, and it hasn't ended, you know, right? Like it's shifted.
Yeah.
People are still dying.
Right. Yeah. Today. People died globally last year of AIDS, believe it or not.
Yeah. And then
like 38 million people in the last 48 years or 40 some years.
Yeah. I think it's really worth thinking about what we can, you know, people who've lived through that time, and, you know, like what lessons you may or may not take, or is there anything useful that you can take from that time?
I remember feeling like incredibly alert and alive, and I knew that was like a way to take care of myself, like a way to have agency against something that seemed like overwhelming and scary and dreadful at any minute. I remember like just checking in on my friends and building my community in a way that I haven't done since. Maybe I've done it, you know, in the last month. I mean, maintaining hellos, maintaining friendships seems much more important than it ever was. And I just those relationships, which, you know, in some ways I've taken for granted. I just want to make sure I nurture them now. And I think I'm probably saying things that everyone else already feels in their own lives, you know, whether they grew up during the worst of the AIDS years or more recently. But yeah, alertness, community. looking for opportunities for humor and joy.
Yeah.
But
I love that. I mean, all of those things feel so right. And that's the spirit of the book that that you wrote too. So it's like I'm asking you this thing, but then you could read the book and you also know what your answer would be.
But don't you remember like dancing a lot? And there were things that just were in the air. They happened. It wasn't like, I or anyone else sat down and said, I need to engineer joy into my life, or anything new agey like that. It was just something that was done. I mean, bodies were always moving and engaged. Just even like the porn party thing was like really a way. We thought it was all going to be a hoot. This was going to be, and maybe that is engineered. We were all going to think this was really funny, and then it turned. It developed a life of its own. It became funnier and then vulnerable, and we weirdly became closer to one another to the point where maybe it was too much. But we're still talking about that experience. How many is it? 30 years later.
There's a line in that scene, the temperature in Lucy's living room changed, or something like that.
Yeah.
And I remember reading it and then hearing you read it. It just is such an example for me of your attention to the connections between people, whether during sex or regarding sex or other kinds of intimacy, and that sort of feeling of like it's so subtle. But I know that moment where you think something's going to be funny and then it's like, is it a little hot? Like, what's going on? Is it vulnerable? Like something, people are looking at each other in different ways. That moment where, you're talking about sort of like feeling protective of the porn with the gay guys in it, right? Like, I love that. All of those feelings at once. And like that line about the temperature of the room changing just totally hit that mark for me.
Thanks. Yeah, we realized we couldn't control the experience. It was controlling us. So really all we had, was our alertness and attention.
And that's what's happening right now, right? Like we are not controlling the experience that all of us on Earth are having. It's like not even, right? Earth.
Yeah.
Which was true of the height of the AIDS pandemic as well.
Exactly.
But we weren't all talking about it.
It was a disease that was undervalued, underrepresented, stigmatized. And I think we were taught culturally not to think our pain was, our right to grieve was real.
Right.
Whether we had lost a friend or family member or whether, it didn't count.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like for me, that's also one of the lessons from that time is that, we have to advocate for people who are not counted, like the government isn't going to do what we needed to do unless we make it. I think that was the thing. But one of the things I've been thinking a lot about, there's a section in the middle of the book, and really soon I think we're going to stop to take some questions. But I just want to talk a little bit about this because I was reading this and thinking how prescient it was, how much of the time, and then also how much of now. There's this section called Heroes.
Mm-hmm.
It's in like, or there's a fragment called Heroes, and there's this line in it, or there's a little bit of it. It's not that anyone is less energetic about saving lives at the end of the world. In fact, many have spent their time on the front lines before their arrival here. It's just that in a town that comports itself as a haven, when there's no resistance from within, the desire to save lives takes a different shape. It happens in houses behind blinds pulled down, and you don't always know who the heroes are. And that feels so much to me, relevant to this moment.
Mm-hmm.
But also that sense of we don't always know what other people's experiences are,
right?
And what people's histories are, and just this idea that this desire to help or to save lives could take lots of different shapes and happens in private and public is really powerful.
There are plenty of people who just don't want to talk about it and don't want to be singled out. And I wanted to make sure the book at least left space and for those people and honored them just by naming that situation.
Yeah, I think that was really just thinking about all the people who were taking care of other people and then who were taken care of, like that community response is so beautiful to think about and to remember and to sort of know that that's something like that's part of our community. That's like queer legacy that's our history.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. I see that there's, well, no, I think we have some time for a couple of more questions. I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the end of the book, because the book shifts really, really abruptly, but not abruptly at all. I mean, really satisfyingly, but sharply is the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
At the there's a shift to the present, and I wonder if you could talk about, because there's a lot of time that's not covered.
Yeah.
And why that moment at the present?
I mean, to my mind, that the breakup in the book, which like happens very close to, to that break, like is like meant to be the arc of a particular period. Like there's just like something, a hope for romance, a hope for connection with another person over time has been, what's the word? It just doesn't seem possible at that point. And like the book could have ended there, but it would have been so desolate. And I wanted, what happened, honestly, I wrote a draft of this book, and literally like days after I was at my doctor's for my physical, and I said, maybe it's time to go on PrEP, which he had suggested to me before, but I knew there was something intimately connected between the act of recovery or interrogation that happened and this decision to say yes to the possibility of a future. And once I realized I realized pretty soon after that needed to go into the book, that it wasn't arbitrary, and it in a book that was so much meditation about the future or the lack of it, all of that was educated anew by my decision to go on that medication. So it could have gone on and on. And
well, I think that's sort of like for me, it's like I wanted it to. I could have had another 30 years of it.
Yeah. I mean, where do you stop, right?
I know, but it totally makes sense that for me it did. It had an aesthetic and a sort of like a narrative feeling of closure, not closure, but sort of like, conclusion at that point, and then the shift to the present. It is so satisfying, but there's also still that longing for all those unknown years.
Yeah.
And also,
between whatever 1994
right.
and 2018. Yeah,
but
two.
It's like in a movie where you see, and then you see the characters when they're very, very, very young, and then you see them much later, and you're like, wow, how, that's like the epilogue. But what's so interesting is it's not an epilogue at all. It feels like the beginning of something, which is, I guess that's sort of like, well, I'm very greedy. So at all points in the book, I just wanted more.
That's good.
Yeah, it was so good. I mean, it was, I don't know. I realized that I shouldn't talk about the end. I shouldn't have been talking about the end, but it's just the writing. I love it so much, and there's so much I want to, it's beautiful.
Thank you.
I think I should. There's questions piling up, and I think we should hear from other people besides me. And it's so just wonderful to talk to you. This is going to maybe be a little weird. I'm going to read people's questions. So, that's what's going to happen now. Okay. And anybody else who wants to ask a question, you can go to the ask a question at the bottom of your screen and ask a question. So here's the first one. Hi, Paul and Andrea. Hi. This is from Ashley. Thank you so much for this. I was wondering, I feel like we're having conversations today and in our current climate about queer rage and tapping into that as a form of communal healing. Could you speak to that? How can we embrace our rage now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that's one of the subjects of the book as well, because the book really wants to think about the consequences of tapping down rage and trying to manage feeling, manage like those ugly emotions out of us. And so it's something that's an ongoing question for me. I mean, I feel like that's something I live with. We all might live with on a day-to-day level. I don't think it's like we step through the gate and we have access to the feelings that scare us. I mean, I guess the trick is like how to tap into that and turn that rage into something productive and energizing. As to how to access that now. Yeah, it's just so hard to know what to do now because this state is we're just like so much on top of it. We have no perspective yet, and we don't even know how this disease is. We don't even know whether you're immune to it after you've tested positive. So I think the complexities of not knowing are making it hard for us to act in multiple ways. And I don't think that's a satisfying answer, but I know that and I'm sure a lot of people are just living in lots of confusion right now because we simply don't know where to stand. It feels like we're, just to use a cliche, that the earth beneath our feet is shifting every day. So I think once we know more, we will be able to work with our rage and do something with it. But there's plenty to be angry about now when you think about this administration. And I didn't say it because it seems too obvious. But
yeah, that really, that really makes so much sense to me that we'll maybe have more access to rage when we know more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think it's such a good question. There's another question from Vanessa.
Hey, Vanessa.
How can you talk about, not how, I'm sorry. I have like quarantine.
I do too.
Lots of, can you talk about living in a place where queer life is centralized? No, I'm going to try it one more time. Can you talk, this is why I'm not a weatherman. Right, I can't read off a teleprompter. Can you talk about how living in a place where queer life is centralized, how that affected your creative expression, your writing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I felt it right away as soon as I moved into town. I mean, I was aware of my body in a way that I hadn't been aware of my body before. Instantly, I walked differently. I breathed differently. I remember holding my shoulders back, and my body wasn't something that I was simply like covering in lots of big clothes. And I know that my work became itself, first became itself in Provincetown. Uh, the writing that I brought to Provincetown from grad school seemed really outmoded in terms of structure and form and style and tone by the time I was in town for 2 months. It's like this, like life felt too unwieldy and wild to be contained by the work I was writing. So instantly I started writing work that I knew my classmates, whom I adored from grad school, would have hated and would have had problems with. And there was such a joy, in a way, at writing this work that was much more compressed and fragmentary, and just imagining their faces, the people I loved, who would just say, no, you're fucking up, no. So I think, yeah, the work I was writing started to draw from multiple sources. It wasn't simply satisfied to be realist fiction. It started to draw from poetry. It started to draw from some of the strategies of fiction, but also from essay. And I just started to make up something that felt more fluid and hard to categorize. And I know I would not be that kind of writer if I hadn't put in my time in Provincetown then. That's seems to me one of the greatest gifts, to be in a place where, I wasn't othered anymore, but in the center of community.
Yes. Okay, we've got a bunch more questions. This is a shorty. Early in tonight's conversation, John asks,
"Hey, John.
Paul said he was thinking about someone who said queerness was aspirational, but I missed the attribution and I've been trying to figure out who said it."
Oh, it was Jose Munoz, M-U-N-tilde-O-Z.
Nice.
What's the cruise? What's his title?
Is it Cruising Utopia, right?
Cruising Utopia.
Yeah. Sometimes I assign little bits of that.
It's such a readable book.
Such a good book. Here's another question. Is this from Melise? Melise, what's up? I'm curious about the process of choosing memoir for you. Have you felt like you've needed to discuss, spotlight, even unpack the purpose of the genre, aside from the content of the book?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm a little bit wary of the memoir word. Just not that I'm not wary of memoirs, but I have questions about the trajectory of the form, that move toward wholeness. And I think what I do might be, it might be a little more unwieldy. That's one of the reasons why it was going to be called a memoir of ... And I couldn't live with that. So it's one of the reasons why it's my life at the end of the world. I could be saying something more lucid right now, but I started writing autobiography because there were books back in the 90s that I encountered, like Lucy Greeley's autobiography, The Face. I adore that book. It felt life-changing to me. Bernard Cooper's work, Truth Serum and Maps to Anywhere, I really loved. And I saw my ex, Mark Doty's books, Firebird and Dog Years and Still Life come into being. And that work seemed to me like it was making itself up. None of those books really follow a predetermined shape, and they set their own terms. They tell the reader how they should be read. And I think that's finally what I always wanted to do. that was part of the instruction of being in Provincetown. Like, okay, build yourself up with the tools you have, how to amplify your strengths and how to locate your weaknesses, whatever some might call weaknesses, and turn them into like gifts.
Yeah. I love that. Also, that idea of like wanting to teach the reader how to read the book or tell the reader what to do. It's also a very toppy mode.
Yeah.
I want to read the next question because we've got time for a couple more questions, and these are such good questions. This is from Jack.
Hey, Jack.
Do you have any thoughts around why queer havens, Provincetown, Fire Island, Bay Area, etc., tend to happen on waterfronts? Did you feel at the edge of the world geographically in living there?
I definitely did. I mean, that great ocean is so vast and kind of scary and loud. I mean, when it's windy, you can hear the ocean roaring into the West End if you listen. And yeah, I'm interested in the idea of these queer havens being as far out as you could go. I mean, Key West, which is there's still queer people there, but it was a queer haven for so long. And yeah, I don't know if that impulse is still with us. I mean, I used to say like there would never be a Provincetown in Westchester or like Fort Lauderdale is much more centralized geographically. It's not, there's a huge queer community, gay men in Fort Lauderdale, but it's not like off the end of the road. It's interesting to me that the movement went from Key West up to there, and I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what that means exactly. I mean, Northampton's not exactly the end of the road either.
No, but I guess Smith was the draw there, and probably Mount Holyoke too. Let's be real. But
I think was about water, and I'm not saying
Well, yeah, the Jack's question was asking about that the geographic end of the world thing, which you talk about so much in the book and so beautifully, but then also just that question of the waterfront. And I was just noticing all the places you were just talking about also have like long histories of having lots of writers and artists, like the Bay Area, Key West, Provincetown, and just thinking about maybe that kind of isolation leading to, I don't know, something like queerness and art making, the connection there.
Yeah, the adventure of that collision.
Yeah. There's actually a question that's sort of more to do with time than with place, but also, to do with place. And this is from Min.
Hey, Min.
I'm wondering if Paul has thought about what this unique era and cultural moment in Provincetown might have been like or felt like had we all been this connected via technology and smartphones back then. Provincetown in the 90s was such a heartfelt analog time, pre-Tinder, pre-all of it. I sometimes worry we're not capable of making that kind of community effort socially now. Sorry, is this too cynical? Lol.
No, it's not cynical at all. I mean, what was amazing about that Provincetown was that it felt like it was making itself up. And to use a metaphor that we just used, it was completely DIY. It was informed by urban culture. I mean, there was like an East Village influence in town. I think that was in part because people were moving there from places like that in order to be part of a supportive community. But it felt like there was a very distinct Provincetown way to dress. And things changed, say, like a few years after that, because once people stopped dying in alarming numbers, there was a global LGBTQ culture to market to, and there were magazines during the early '90s, but it just it became, everything became branded and known in a way, and you were told like what to listen to and how to dress, and we could decide we wanted to go along or not. And I loved the urbanity of that strange little culture that sort of developed by, oh, those are really cool shoes. I think those shoes are really hard to get. I need them. Now, you would just look on someone's Instagram and they would, the maker of the shoe would be right there, and then you could go right online and buy the shoe. And we had to listen, and the news was like passed one-to-one. That's why mentorship meant so much, because there weren't official sources.
Yeah, there was so much lore. He really relied on lore in a way that is not the same now, and like we did so much code reading.
Right. And being cool was very complicated.
And it took longer than it does now.
Yeah. It took work.
It took all your time.
It took all of your time.
And then you never achieved it if you were me. There's a couple more questions here. And how about, here's one. This one says, "Hi, Paul and Andrea." This is from Daniel K. Hey, Daniel.
Hey, Daniel.
This may be an odd question, but I wonder if you had thoughts about talk about revisiting 90s queer experiences from a present day lens when so much of the discourse has changed. So maybe this is related to formal, uncategorizable aspects of both Later and Paul Takes the Form of Immortal Girl. So do we have questions about, or can we talk about what it means to revisit 90s queer experiences and culture today? Mm-hmm. So much of the discourse has changed. So yeah, that's a great question.
It is a great question. Do you have any ideas?
I don't know. I mean, I think, I was really noticing that you did something that I was always trying to do in my Paul. I was always trying to sort of stay true to what was possible for Paul to think at the time, like the structures of thought being sort of historically located. Like, what is the condition of possibility for Paul to think this word, right? And I noticed, and I think this is like really like memoir or writing in which it's sort of like this retrospective narrator. When it works really well, it works because the narrator is able to show us how they thought at the time.
Yeah.
Right. And I think
was working. Yeah.
Yeah. So can you talk about that? Sort of like being sort of like did you get like method about getting back into the time? Like, did you like, do power posing or wear outfits or music? Like, how did you get yourself into that headspace? Yeah.
There's like the pop jeans, like really like super short. No, right, really that particular era has never, it's always felt close to me. It's always felt near and accessible. And it's certainly not the case from say 95 or 96 on. I mean, my apprehension of those years is just like kind of blurry.
And I feel like the whole thing is like Vaseline on the lens.
Yeah.
From like 95 to like now.
Right. But I think, the alertness that we all feel now seems so commonplace to me. I mean, that sense of uncertainty. I mean, it's also, occasionally I have to remind myself that that era that I was accessing had no idea that life-extending drugs were on the way. We just thought this was going to be the way it was from the here on out. And that's kind of a shocking reminder because, you know, those people managed to be, you know, present and engaged, thinking that that was going to be the condition of death, of losing, living in a town in which there were 4 funerals a week, that was just going to be the ongoing condition of us. So, that era has never left me. Even when I listen to, I made a mixtape of music from that era. I mean, I'm probably deluding myself, but I think that music sounds super fresh.
Oh, it's fantastic. I've been listening to that Spotify playlist for like a week straight.
It's so weird and like full of like bizarre chord changes. Even at the same time, it's ridiculously accessible, but it feels like it's off the grid, like harmonically. And I find that really thrilling. But, you know, if I listen to something from 1996, I would say, ugh, that's so dated. And but it might have had to do with that art created at the center of emergency, in a way feels timeless to me, because a lot of that work was quite literally an act of survival, you know, an act of staying alive. It was written in the hope of keeping not only the creator alive, but other people alive and laughing and irreverent and seeing and engaged and sexy and all of that.
Yeah. Well, that is going to lead into this next question, which is from Lazuli. Hi, Lazuli. The question is, Paul, do you think writing this text was itself an invention of a kind of intimacy?
That's a great question.
Yeah, it is.
It wouldn't have been satisfying to me if I were simply writing what I already knew. You know, I felt like half of the work of this book is about interrogation and asking questions and trying to get closer to the awkwardness and desire and tenderness of lived experience. So, I wasn't happy when the book felt comfortable. I wanted it to feel unsettling moment by moment. And by unsettling, I hope I mean intimate. Like, it's not that, you know, there isn't something like beautiful and tender about intimacy, but it makes us nervous at the same time too. It makes us think about boundaries and where we begin and end, and that doesn't always feel good.
Oh, I think we're running out of time for more questions. There is one question that it's actually about my bookshelf. Yes, you can't really see my bookshelf very well because I don't know how to make my screen not mirror. You don't see Paul's book up there. You might see Carter Sickles' The Prettiest Star.
Yay.
Or Paul has said some lovely words about this book. But you don't see Paul's book, sadly, because I had to read it on the device, but I'm really looking forward to physical object. I think what the time of everything stopping happened. Yeah. I will say you can look at any of these books on the bookshelf, but even better would be to buy them by hitting the little green button and purchase later here for 10% off. Now I'm just trying to tell you to buy books from Center for Fiction.
Thanks, Andrea.
Yeah, because it is so wonderful that you host these events, and
Yes.
to be in conversation with one of my heroes and just beloved people in this world is such a pleasure. Thank you, Paul, for
thank you, Andrea,
talking with me tonight.
Yeah, you too. This was a joy. Thank you, Melanie, for making this happen.
Thank you both for a wonderful event, and I'm sure everybody in their own living rooms all over the country are clapping for you right now and going to buy your book if they haven't already read it. And I will also say it's a great book to read right now. I just finished it myself and it was beautiful. So thank you both, and goodbye to our audience.
Goodbye, everybody. Take care.
Goodbye.